The Untold Story of Kitihawa, the Aboriginal Autochthonous woman who anchored Chicago's indigenous legacy. In the vast historical narrative of Chicago's origins, one name often remains overshadowed despite her pivotal role in shaping the city's indigenous and colonial foundations. Kitihawa, the wife of John Baptiste Point du Sable. Her story is not merely one of companionship, but of sovereignty, cultural continuity, and indigenous governance deeply rooted in the Autochthonous American tradition. Kitihawa, the Autochthonous matriarch of Chicago. Before European encroachment and the establishment of what is now known as Chicago, Kitihawa was born into the sovereign lineage of the Illiniwek Confederation, particularly the Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Chippewa, and Odawa peoples. These nations, known collectively as the Council of Three Fires, were part of the larger mound-building civilizations with deep spiritual, economic, and social ties to the land long before the French, Spanish, or British arrived. Her name, Kitihawa, carries linguistic roots from the indigenous languages spoken by her people, linking her identity to the natural world and the ancestral governance systems that existed for millennia. She was a direct descendant of the Autochthonous peoples recognized in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary as the copper-colored races found here by Europeans. This definition affirms the deep-seated indigenous sovereignty that predated colonial naming conventions and territorial claims. A sacred union. Marriage as a political and economic alliance. John Baptiste Point du Sable's marriage to Kitihawa was far more than a personal union. It was an alliance between the Old World and the First Nations of the Americas. Kitihawa's status in her indigenous society granted du Sable legitimacy, access to indigenous trade networks, and protection under the established laws of the land, which were already in place before European intervention. In 1778, their marriage was formally recognized by the colonial authorities in a Catholic ceremony, but it had already been legitimized under indigenous customs long before European documentation. Through Kitihawa, du Sable was granted rights to the land, which allowed him to establish a successful trading post, what would eventually become the commercial epicenter of Chicago. Chicago before it was Chicago. Before the city was named Chicago, it was known by its indigenous name, Shikaakwa, derived from the Miami, Illinois language meaning wild onion or skunk plant, referencing the native vegetation that thrived in the area. The land was a significant hub of indigenous commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange for thousands of years. French explorers and Spanish conquistadors later modified the pronunciation to Chicago, but its original name remains a testament to the deep autochthonous roots of the region. The city's foundation was built upon the governance systems, agricultural innovations, and trade routes established by Kitihawa's people, long before the colonial frontier arrived. Kitihawa's legacy, the true indigenous matriarch of Chicago. Kitihawa was not just a wife, she was a matriarch, a leader, and an embodiment of indigenous sovereignty. Through her, the bloodline of the city's first recorded family was rooted in the autochthonous peoples of Turtle Island. Despite the colonial erasure of indigenous women's contributions, Kitihawa's role remains undeniable in the shaping of Chicago's identity. Today, it is imperative to recognize that the legacy of Chicago is not merely tied to John Baptiste Point du Sable, but is equally indebted to Kitihawa, whose indigenous lineage provided the foundation upon which the city stands. Her descendants and the broader Autochthonous community continue to uphold the traditions, governance, and rights that have existed since time immemorial, honoring the true founders of Chicago. As we bring forth the true narrative of Chicago's origins, Kitihawa's story must be reclaimed, honored, and integrated into the educational frameworks of history. She was not an afterthought, but a fundamental force in the establishment of what we now call Chicago. Without her, du Sable's success, legitimacy, and settlement in the region would not have been possible. To honor her memory, efforts must be made to ensure that Kitihawa's name is not lost in the shadows of history, but uplifted as the true indigenous founder of Chicago. Institutions, museums, and cultural centers must take responsibility in restoring her legacy to its rightful place. As we navigate the modern world, the spirit of Kitihawa lives on through the Autochthonous peoples of Turtle Island who continue to fight for recognition, sovereignty, and the preservation of their ancestral ways. Chicago was and always will be indigenous land.